Take him outside. He's ruining the atmosphere." The manager snapped, loud enough to slice through the soft jazz and clinking glasses like a blade. And just like that, every head in the restaurant turned toward table 12, where a man in a worn gray hoodie sat quietly with a single glass of water, his shoulders still, his eyes unreadable, as if the humiliation wasn't new to him, as if he had heard worse and survived it all before. And yet what no one in that room knew, not the laughing couple by the window, not the impatient businessman checking his gold watch, not even the manager barking orders with forced authority, was that the man they were about to throw out had signed a $2.4 billion acquisition just 3 days ago, that his name was Ethan Cole, and that he owned more of this city than the skyline itself. But tonight none of that mattered, because tonight he had chosen invisibility, chosen to step into a world where respect wasn't guaranteed, where people revealed who they truly were when they thought no one important was watching. And the restaurant itself was the perfect stage. Polished marble floors reflecting warm amber light, crystal glasses lined like soldiers across white linen tables, the kind of place where a single steak cost more than a week's rent for most Americans, the kind of place where appearances were currency and judgment came quicker than service. And in the middle of it all stood Maya Brooks, a waitress who had learned early in life that dignity was something you carried yourself because the world rarely handed it to you. Her uniform pressed, her posture steady, her eyes observant in a way that missed nothing, not the way guests avoided eye contact with staff, not the way voices changed depending on who they thought deserved respect, not the way silence could sometimes be louder than words. And when the manager gestured sharply toward Ethan with a look that said deal with it, she hesitated for just half a second, not out of fear, but because she recognized something deeper than the situation itself, something about the way the man sat there without pleading, without anger, just calm in the middle of quiet rejection. And that kind of calm didn't belong to someone broken. It belonged to someone who understood the room better than the room understood itself. She walked over, her steps measured, her voice steady, and instead of rushing him out or apologizing for his presence like the others expected, she simply said, "Sir, are you okay? Do you need anything?" And it was such a small sentence, so simple it almost disappeared into the noise, but it carried something rare in that room, something that couldn't be bought or faked, genuine respect, not for status, not for appearance, but for a person. And for the first time that night, Ethan looked up, really looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of something unexpected, not surprise exactly, but recognition, as if he had just found the one variable in the room that didn't follow the script. Around them the whispers continued, the judgment lingered, the pressure built. But in that brief moment between a so-called nobody and the only person who chose to see him, something shifted, subtle but undeniable. Because sometimes the most powerful test isn't about who holds the power. It's about who chooses to show kindness when there is none to gain. And Maya Brooks had just made a choice that would change everything. Even if she didn't know it yet, the manager's smile tightened the moment he noticed Maya had not followed instructions, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor as he approached, each step echoing louder than the music, louder than the conversations that suddenly felt forced and uneasy, because nothing disrupts a room full of wealth faster than someone refusing to play their assigned role. And Maya could feel it, the shift in the air, the subtle tension pressing against her shoulders like an invisible weight. But she did not step back. She did not rush the man away. She simply stood there with quiet composure, her tray balanced in one hand, her voice calm as she asked again if he needed anything. And around them the reactions began to ripple. A woman at the corner table whispered behind her glass. A man in a tailored suit chuckled under his breath. Another guest shook his head as if witnessing something inappropriate, something out of place. Because in rooms like this kindness had rules, and those rules were tied to status. And this man had none, at least not the kind they could see. The manager leaned in slightly, his tone lower now, but edged with irritation as he said, "Maya, we have standards here. Do not encourage this." And the word "this" hung in the air heavier than it should have, reducing a human being to a problem, a disruption, a mistake that needed to be corrected. And for a brief second Maya's fingers tightened around the edge of her tray, not out of fear but out of restraint, because she had heard variations of that tone her entire life, the kind that tried to make you smaller without ever saying it directly, the kind that expected compliance wrapped in politeness. But she had also learned something else, something quieter and stronger, that dignity does not require permission. She turned slightly toward the manager, her voice still respectful, but now carrying a firmness that was impossible to ignore. He is a guest, just like everyone else. And it was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it landed with the weight of truth in a place where truth was often edited for comfort. The manager blinked, caught off guard not by the words themselves, but by the fact that they had been spoken at all, because in his world staff agreed, staff nodded, staff moved on. They did not challenge the script. And yet here was Maya, not raising her voice, not causing a scene, simply refusing to pretend that respect was something reserved for a select few. And behind her Ethan watched it unfold, his expression unchanged but his attention sharper now, as if each word, each reaction was being carefully noted, measured against something unseen. He had walked into this night expecting indifference, expecting quiet dismissal, but this steady resistance wrapped in grace, was something else entirely, something rare enough to matter. The manager straightened his jacket, forcing a thin smile as he turned to Ethan. "Sir, if you are not ordering, we will have to ask you to leave." The sentence delivered with rehearsed politeness that barely concealed its intent, and for a moment the entire room seemed to lean in, waiting for the man in the hoodie to respond, to apologize, to shrink, to confirm their assumptions. But Ethan did not move. He did not rush to explain himself. Instead, he reached slowly for the menu Maya had placed beside him earlier, his fingers brushing the edge as if testing the weight of the moment itself. And then, in a voice calm enough to cut through the tension without raising it, he said, "I think I will stay a little longer," and the simplicity of it unsettled them more than any argument could have, because it did not fit the narrative they had already decided. It did not match the image they had constructed, and Maya, standing there between expectation and reality, realized that whatever this night was becoming, it was no longer ordinary. It was no longer just another shift filled with polite smiles and silent endurance. It was something deeper, something that would reveal more about everyone in that room than they were prepared to show. And without realizing it, she had just stepped into the center of it. A ripple of quiet discomfort spread across the dining room, not loud enough to be called a scene, but sharp enough to make every conversation feel slightly off balance, as if the rhythm of the night had been interrupted by something no one could quite control. And Maya felt it in the way eyes lingered a second too long, in the way the manager stepped back but did not walk away, calculating, watching, deciding whether to escalate or retreat, because power in places like this was never about volume. It was about who bent first, and right now no one was bending. Not the man in the hoodie who sat with an almost unsettling calm. Not Maya who stood her ground without raising her voice. And certainly not the manager who had built his authority on the assumption that people would always comply. A nearby guest cleared his throat and spoke just loud enough to be heard. "If he cannot afford the place, he should not be here." The sentence delivered casually, as if it were common sense, as if it were a rule written somewhere between the wine list and the dress code. And a few quiet nods followed, not out of conviction, but out of comfort, because agreeing required less courage than questioning. Maya turned slightly toward the voice, not confrontational, not defensive, just present, and said, "Everyone deserves a seat unless they choose to leave." And again it was simple, almost too simple, but simplicity has a way of exposing what complexity tries to hide. The guest looked away, uninterested in a conversation that did not validate his assumption, while the manager exhaled slowly, his patience thinning in ways he could not openly show. "Maya, step away from the table," he said, more controlled now, more deliberate, as if each word had been weighed before leaving his mouth. But beneath that control was something else, something closer to discomfort than authority, because the longer this continued, the more the room began to question not the man in the hoodie, but the way he was being treated, and that shift, subtle as it was, threatened the order the manager relied on. Ethan noticed it too, the micro-expressions, the shifting posture of the guests, the slight hesitation in the manager's tone. It was the kind of data he had built his entire career reading. Except this time it was not a boardroom, it was a dining room, and the stakes were not measured in dollars, but in character. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the movement small but intentional, and glanced around the room with a quiet awareness that felt almost out of place in someone they had already dismissed. Then his gaze returned to Maya, and there was something unspoken in that look. Not gratitude exactly. Not yet, but recognition, as if he had just confirmed a hypothesis he had not fully believed before walking in. Maya reached for a clean napkin and placed it neatly beside his glass, her movement steady, unaffected by the tension that continued to hum beneath the surface. "Would you like to see the menu, or just stay with the water?" she asked, offering him the same options she would offer anyone else. No more, no less. And that equality, that refusal to treat him as either less or more than he appeared, carried a quiet power that did not need to announce itself. The manager watched, waiting for the moment he could regain control of the situation, but that moment did not come, not yet, because something had already shifted in the room, something small but undeniable, the idea that respect might not be reserved for those who could afford it. And that idea, once introduced, was not so easy to dismiss. Ethan picked up the menu this time, his fingers steady, his voice even as he said, "I think I will take a look." And in that ordinary response was an extraordinary decision, because he was not just staying for the meal anymore. He was staying for something else entirely, something unfolding in real time, something that could not be bought, negotiated, or forced, something that only revealed itself when people believed no one important was watching. And for the first time that night, the most important person in the room had decided to keep watching. The menu rested in Ethan's hands, but he was not reading it the way most people did, not scanning for prices or descriptions, but observing. The room reflected faintly in the glossy surface, the subtle glances, the quiet judgments, the shifting alliances that formed whenever someone stepped outside the expected script. And what he saw confirmed something he had long suspected, but rarely witnessed this clearly. That respect in places like this was rarely about service and almost always about status. And yet Maya moved through it differently, unaffected in a way that did not feel naive but intentional, as if she had made a decision long ago about who she would be regardless of where she stood. She returned moments later with a small basket of bread, placing it gently on the table without announcement, without hesitation, the same way she would for any guest who had been seated long enough. And the action itself seemed to stir something in the room, because it crossed an invisible line. It treated him not as a temporary inconvenience, but as someone who belonged. And belonging was something the others guarded carefully. A man 2 tables over leaned back in his chair, watching with mild amusement as he said to his companion, "This is going to cost her." The words spoken casually, but carrying the quiet certainty of someone who believed he understood how the world worked. Consequences for stepping out of place, penalties for disrupting the hierarchy. And Maya heard it, not because it was loud, but because she had learned to hear the things people tried to say without saying them directly. She did not react, not outwardly, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a grounding, as if she had anchored herself deeper into her choice. Ethan noticed that too, the way she absorbed the moment without letting it define her, the way she continued to operate with the same steady rhythm, offering water to another table, checking on a family near the window, moving through the space with a quiet efficiency that did not seek approval and did not shrink under pressure. And it was in that consistency that something became clear. This was not a one-time act of kindness, not a spontaneous gesture meant to impress or rebel. This was who she was. The manager, however, was reaching a different conclusion, one built on control rather than observation. He stepped aside and spoke briefly with another staff member, his voice low but urgent, his eyes returning again and again to table 12, calculating the optics, the potential disruption, the risk to the carefully curated atmosphere that guests paid for. Because in his mind this was no longer about a single customer, it was about perception, and perception in a place like this was everything. When he approached again, his tone had changed, softer on the surface but carrying a finality beneath it. "Maya, I need you to step away now," he said, not asking this time, not negotiating, but issuing a directive wrapped in politeness. And for a moment the air seemed to pause, the kind of pause that happens right before something irreversible takes shape. Maya turned to him fully now, her expression calm, but her eyes steady in a way that made it clear she understood exactly what was being asked of her, and more importantly, what it would mean to comply. Behind her, Ethan closed the menu slowly, placing it back on the table with deliberate care, the sound soft but distinct enough to draw attention. And when he looked up again, there was a clarity in his gaze that had not been there before, not hidden anymore, not observing from a distance, but present in the moment, engaged in a way that suggested whatever was about to happen next would not simply pass unnoticed. And in that quiet intersection of authority and integrity, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which one would give way first. Maya did not move right away, not because she did not understand the instruction, but because she understood it too well, the quiet expectation behind it, the unspoken rule that some people were worth less space than others. And for a brief second the entire room seemed to lean forward, waiting for her to step back into that invisible line, the one she had been expected to follow without question. The manager's expression remained composed, but his eyes revealed the urgency beneath it. This was no longer a suggestion. It was a test of control, and control, once challenged, had to be reclaimed quickly or not at all. "I am helping a guest," Maya said, her voice steady, not loud, not defiant, just clear, and the simplicity of her words landed harder than any argument could have, because they left no room for interpretation, no space to disguise the truth. A few guests exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others curious, as if the situation had shifted from inconvenience to something far more revealing. The manager inhaled slowly, his patience thinning to a fine edge as he replied, "You are disrupting the experience for everyone else." And that word experience echoed through the room like a justification, a shield used to protect decisions that were never really about service. Ethan listened carefully, his posture unchanged but his attention sharper than ever, because this was the moment where intention became action, where people revealed not what they claimed to value, but what they were willing to stand for. Maya glanced briefly around the room, taking in the polished tables, the carefully curated atmosphere, the guests who had come expecting perfection and comfort. And then she looked back at the man in front of her, still seated, still calm, still treated as if his presence needed permission, and something in her settled, not a surge of emotion, not a dramatic realization, just a quiet decision that felt as natural as breathing. "Respect does not take away from anyone else," she said, her tone unchanged, but her words carried a weight that could not be easily dismissed. The manager's jaw tightened slightly, caught between maintaining composure and enforcing authority, because every second this continued, the narrative slipped further from his control. A woman near the center of the room set her glass down slowly, watching more intently now, while a man at the bar shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to uncertainty. And in the middle of it all, Ethan finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with deliberate calm. He reached into his pocket and placed a folded bill on the table, not to pay, not to leave, but simply as a gesture that he could, that the assumption being made about him might not be as solid as it seemed. The action was small, almost insignificant, but it cracked something open, a moment of hesitation that spread quietly across the room. Maya noticed it, but she did not react. She did not change her tone or her posture, because her choice had never been about proving anything. It had been about doing what was right before anyone knew why it mattered. The manager saw the bill too, his eyes narrowing slightly as doubt crept into his certainty, and doubt, in a place built on appearances, was dangerous, because once people began to question what they were seeing, the entire structure of assumption could collapse. Ethan leaned back again, his gaze steady, his voice calm as he said, "I think I will order now." And in that moment the room shifted once more, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to be felt, because something had changed, not just in how he was perceived, but in how everyone present was beginning to see themselves. And at the center of it all stood Maya, not louder, not stronger, but unwavering. The only one who had treated a stranger with the same respect she would offer anyone else, long before it became the right thing to do. The words settled into the air with a quiet finality that no one could ignore, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hesitate, caught between what they had assumed and what they were now beginning to question. The manager straightened his posture as if preparing to regain control, but something had already shifted beyond his reach, because once doubt enters a room built on certainty, it does not leave easily. Ethan's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table as he glanced down at the menu again. Not rushed, not pressured, just deliberate, as if the decision to stay had already been made long before anyone else realized it. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a calm authority that did not match the image they had formed of him. "What do you recommend?" he asked Maya, and it was such a simple question, one that would normally pass unnoticed, but in that moment it carried weight, because it acknowledged her not as an obstacle, not as a mistake, but as someone whose opinion mattered. Maya met his gaze without hesitation, her tone professional but warm as she described a few options, her knowledge clear, her delivery effortless, as if nothing about the situation around them had shaken her rhythm, and that consistency, that refusal to be altered by pressure, became more noticeable than anything else in the room. A couple near the window leaned closer together, whispering now not about the man in the hoodie, but about the way the situation was unfolding. The narrative shifting in real time. The manager remained still for a moment longer before stepping back, not in surrender but in recalibration, his mind working quickly to regain control of a situation that was no longer predictable, because what had started as a minor disruption was turning into something far more visible, something that exposed more than he had intended. Ethan closed the menu and nodded slightly. "I will have the steak," he said, his tone even. The choice ordinary, but the moment anything but. Maya wrote it down with steady hands, her movements unchanged, her focus unwavering. And as she turned to place the order, she passed by the manager without pause, not defiant, not dismissive, simply continuing her work as she always had. And that quiet continuation, that refusal to be redirected by pressure, carried a kind of strength that did not need to announce itself. Behind her, Ethan reached again into his pocket, this time placing a second folded bill beside the first, not to display wealth, but to remove any remaining doubt about his ability to pay. And the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, a shift in posture, a recalculation in perception, because the room had been built on assumptions, and those assumptions were beginning to crack. A man at the bar who had earlier dismissed him now watched more carefully, his expression no longer amused but thoughtful, while the woman who had whispered earlier now sat back in her chair, her gaze lingering longer than before, and in the center of it all Ethan remained composed, observing, measuring, not just the reactions but the timing of them, who changed quickly, who resisted, who pretended nothing had shifted at all, because those details mattered. They always had. Maya returned moments later with a glass of water, refreshed and a quiet. "Your order will be out shortly." Her tone unchanged, her presence steady, and for the first time that night the room felt less certain, less controlled, as if something fundamental had been disturbed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt beneath every conversation, every glance, every silence. Because what had begun as a test of one man's appearance was slowly becoming something else entirely, a reflection of everyone watching, and whether they realized it or not, they were all being measured by something far more honest than status. The plate arrived with quiet precision, set gently in front of Ethan as if the moment itself required care, the scent of grilled steak rising subtly into the warm air, blending with the low hum of conversation that had never quite returned to normal, because even as forks resumed and glasses clinked, something underneath it all had shifted, something that could not be undone simply by continuing as if nothing had happened. Maya placed the dish down with the same composed professionalism she had shown all night, her voice calm as she said, "Please let me know if you need anything else." And then she stepped back, not lingering, not expecting acknowledgement, simply doing her job the way she always had. But this time her presence carried weight, not because she had demanded it, but because she had earned it in a way the room was only beginning to understand. Ethan looked down at the plate for a moment, not to admire the food, but to consider the sequence of events that had led here, every glance, every word, every reaction, each one forming a pattern clearer than any report or meeting could ever provide. He picked up his fork slowly, cutting into the steak with measured ease, as if nothing about the situation was unusual, and that calm, that complete lack of urgency, unsettled the room more than any confrontation could have, because it suggested control, not the kind that needed to be announced, but the kind that simply existed regardless of circumstance. A man at the bar leaned closer to the bartender, whispering something that caused the bartender to glance briefly toward table 12, curiosity replacing indifference, while the couple near the window now watched openly, their earlier judgment replaced by quiet interest, as if they were witnessing something they did not fully understand but could not ignore. The manager remained at a distance now, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral, but his attention fixed, because whatever this had become, it was no longer something he could easily dismiss or redirect. And then it happened. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, Ethan reached up and adjusted the sleeve of his hoodie. And for a brief moment the fabric shifted just enough to reveal the edge of a watch beneath it. Not flashy, not oversized, but unmistakably precise in its design. The kind of watch that did not rely on logos or shine to signal its value. The kind that only those familiar with certain circles would recognize. The bartender noticed it first, his eyes narrowing slightly before flicking back to the man's face, recalculating, reassessing. And then the man at the bar followed his gaze, catching the same detail, his posture shifting subtly as realization began to take shape. It was not certainty yet, not a full understanding, but it was enough to introduce doubt, and doubt, once planted, spreads quietly but quickly. The manager saw it too, not the watch itself but the change in attention, the way certain guests were now looking not with dismissal, but with curiosity. And that was the moment his confidence faltered, just slightly, just enough to be felt. Because the foundation of his authority had always relied on clear distinctions, who belonged and who did not. And now that line was beginning to blur. Maya returned to the table once more, this time simply to refill the water glass, her movements as steady as ever, her focus unchanged. She did not notice the watch, or if she did not react, because her actions had never depended on what someone owned, only on who they were in that moment. Ethan looked up at her again, and this time there was something different in his expression, not just observation, not just recognition, but a quiet decision forming behind his eyes, as if the test he had set in motion was reaching a point where answers were no longer theoretical. They were real, visible, undeniable. And as he set his fork down gently against the plate, the soft sound seemed to echo further than it should have, because in a room where everything had been built on appearance, something genuine had just taken root, and it was about to change everything. A quiet murmur began to spread, not loud enough to interrupt the room, but strong enough to change its rhythm, like a subtle shift in current that everyone could feel, but no one wanted to acknowledge first. The bartender leaned closer to the man beside him, whispering something more urgent now, and within seconds the attention that had once dismissed Ethan started to reorganize itself, eyes no longer glancing past him but returning, lingering, searching for confirmation of something they were only beginning to suspect. And Ethan noticed every bit of it, not with satisfaction, not with pride, but with the calm awareness of someone who had seen this transformation before. The moment when perception catches up to reality. Maya approached again, unaware of the growing tension behind her, carrying a small tray. With quiet precision, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, because to her nothing fundamental had shifted. He was still a guest, still someone to be treated with the same respect she had shown from the beginning. And that consistency, that refusal to adjust based on status, now stood in sharp contrast to everything else happening in the room. Ethan looked up at her as she placed a fresh glass of water beside him, and for a brief moment the noise around them seemed to fade. "Thank you," he said, simple, direct, without performance, and Maya nodded slightly, her response just as natural. Of course. And in that exchange there was something the others were only now beginning to understand. That respect offered without expectation carried a different kind of weight. The manager stepped forward again, but this time his approach was slower, more measured, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful restraint, because uncertainty had taken root, and it was beginning to show. "Sir," he said, his tone noticeably more polite, "we want to make sure you are comfortable this evening." And the shift was unmistakable, not just in the words but in the intention behind them, a recalibration driven not by principle, but by doubt. Ethan met his gaze calmly, holding it just long enough to make the silence stretch, just long enough for the room to feel it. And then he reached up again, this time pulling the edge of his hoodie back slightly, revealing more of the watch beneath. the clean lines, the understated craftsmanship, the kind of detail that spoke quietly but clearly to those who knew what to look for. The bartender's expression changed first, recognition replacing curiosity, and then it spread, table by table, glance by glance, until the room that had once dismissed him was now reevaluating everything they thought they understood. The manager's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders lowering, his tone softening further as realization began to settle in. Not fully, not completely, but enough to alter his stance. And through it all, Maya remained the same, her focus on the task in front of her, her actions unchanged, because her behavior had never depended on who he might be, only on who she chose to be. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, and something in his expression resolved. The quiet decision now complete, the test no longer ongoing but concluded, he reached into his pocket once more, this time placing a sleek card on the table beside the folded bills, its surface simple, almost unremarkable at first glance. But those who recognized it did not need more than a second. The energy in the room tightened instantly, conversations faltering, attention locking into place, because what had been uncertain was now becoming undeniable. And as the manager's eyes dropped to the card and then quickly lifted again, his composure nearly breaking under the weight of sudden realization, one truth became clear to everyone watching. The man they had nearly asked to leave was never the least important person in the room. He had simply chosen to be unseen. And now that choice was about to end. The card sat there in silence, simple, unassuming, yet heavier than anything else in the room. And for a brief moment no one moved. No one spoke, because the truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in slowly, unmistakably, forcing every person present to confront what they had just revealed about themselves. The manager's eyes flicked between the card and Ethan's face, his expression tightening as recognition fully took hold. The careful composure he had maintained all evening now replaced by something closer to unease. "Mr. Cole," he said finally, the name coming out softer than intended, stripped of the authority it once carried. And just like that, the illusion collapsed. The quiet murmurs turned into a low wave of realization, guests shifting in their seats, glances exchanged with a new kind of awareness, because the man they had dismissed, questioned, nearly removed, was no longer an assumption. He was a fact. Ethan did not rush to respond. He did not stand abruptly or raise his voice. Instead, he remained seated, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, as if the room had simply caught up to something he had known all along. "You were saying something about standards," he said calmly, his tone even, not accusatory, not harsh, but impossible to ignore. And the question lingered in the air longer than any apology could have, because it was not just directed at the manager, it was directed at everyone who had watched, judged, agreed without thinking. The manager swallowed, his hands clasping lightly in front of him as he tried to regain footing. "We strive to provide the best experience for all our guests," he replied. The words rehearsed, but now fragile under the weight of context. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the answer without accepting it, his eyes moving briefly across the room, taking in the faces that now looked away, the same faces that had once stared without hesitation. And then he looked back at Maya, who stood just a few steps away, her expression unchanged, her posture as steady as it had been from the beginning, because nothing about her actions needed to be rewritten, nothing required correction. She had treated him the same before and after the reveal, and that consistency spoke louder than anything else in the room. Ethan reached for the card again, turning it once between his fingers before setting it back down, not as a symbol of power, but as a quiet conclusion. "She was the only one who got it right," he said, his voice measured, directed not at the manager alone but at the entire space. And the statement settled deeply, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. The manager nodded quickly, almost reflexively. "Of course, she is one of our best," he added, trying to reclaim the narrative, to align himself with what had just been revealed. But Ethan's gaze held him there for a moment longer, just enough to make it clear that recognition after the fact did not carry the same weight as integrity in the moment. Maya shifted slightly, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, simply aware that something had changed around her even if she had not. Ethan stood then, slowly, the movement drawing quiet attention once more, But this time it was different. Not curiosity, not judgment, but respect mixed with something else, something closer to reflection. He looked at Maya again, a faint nod acknowledging what words did not need to explain, and then he said, "Kindness should not depend on who is watching." The sentence simple, almost understated, yet it carried a finality that closed the night in a way no grand gesture could have. He left the folded bills and the card on the table, not as a display, not as a reward, but as a reminder, and as he walked toward the exit, no one stopped him, no one questioned his place, because the room had already learned what it needed to learn. And behind him Maya remained where she was, not elevated, not transformed, just herself, the same person she had been from the start. The only difference now was that everyone else had finally seen it.